Hello and welcome to this episode of In Conversation. I'm Judith Rinehart of the Rinehart Gallery here in Seattle, Washington. I am honored to have Emily Gherard in the gallery today to discuss the evolution of her most current body of work and her exhibition, Not A Billboard, on view through November 24th. Emily has been exhibiting her work regularly for the past 20 years and is included in a number of prestigious public and private collections throughout the United States. Most recently, she was awarded the 2021 Joan Mitchell Fellowship Grant, joining an exclusive cohort of artists who have been nationally recognized for their merit and their advancement in contemporary art. Congratulations, Emily. Joining us to interview Emily is her longtime friend, collaborator, and a fantastic local artist himself, David Hightone. His work can be found locally at the Linda Hodges Gallery, and his next exhibition will be held at the Friesen Gallery in Sun Valley. Thank you all so much for watching and celebrating with us and with Emily. On to the interview.
Hello, my name is David Hightone, a local artist here in Seattle, and I'm sitting down with Emily Gherard to talk about her new show, Not A Billboard.
Hello, my name is Emily Gherard. This is my show, Not A Billboard, at Rinehart in Seattle, and I'm really honored to have my dear friend David Hightone here with me to help me discuss the show. David Hightone and I have talked work and talked art for many, many years. It's been my pleasure to talk with him about his work at many kind of similar forms. And now I'm excited to reverse the roles.
Very good. Well, let's start that role reversal. This is a question that comes up. I mean, actually, you've asked me similar questions, so I'm just going to take a page out of your book. And but it seems to really be prescient based on the work I'm surrounded by. And to talk about your handling of materials and your relationship to whatever media you happen to be working with. Going back, the first time I saw your work, back when you were working, you're primarily a painter, and the way that you handled paint was very respectful to its capabilities without the kind of showy impasto, look what I can do with paint approach, but you really let the paint sing in a manner that was appropriate to the subject matter that you were focused on. And I feel like that was one of the first things. There was an honesty in that, and an unfussiness, and a nakedness about the way that you treated paint. And that's something as your work has progressed, as you become more focused on drawing and sculpture, I see that same attention to kind of the voice of the media that you're working with. And I'm wondering where that comes from and how that became thematically important.
Thank you for the question. I think that materials are very important to me. I do self-identify as a painter because I love that weird two-dimensional space. But within that two-dimensional space, the materials and the using of the materials and the exploring of materials and the working of different combinations and techniques is really vital to the making of the work. As an artist and as somebody who, makes my things by hand and is involved in every single millisecond of the process, what I have control over is the making of it. I am primarily a visually abstract artist, and so people come to my work and they see what they see. Now, what I put into that work is very specific and very intentional. But at the end of the day, I only have control over how the work is made, right? I don't really have any control over everything else. How it's perceived, right? And so the making of the work, every decision along that way is my way of controlling the image, my way of presenting my content, my way of telling my story through the work. I also am always looking for a way to think with my hands. You know, I work on pieces for long periods of time, so work isn't made in a moment. It's evolved and shifted, and, you know, pieces in this show, pieces of paper in this show are, some of them, years old that have been getting kind of like surfaced back up to the pile and get repurposed, reused. And so I have a long-term relationship with these pieces in the making of these pieces. And so I think that in that time spent with the materials is part of their content. In this show specifically, the work in this show is both works on paper and so drawings on paper that are made out of collaged bits of marks. So some of them are one piece of paper with a drawing on it, but the majority of the work in the drawings in this show are made out of small pieces of paper that I'll work on a drawing, then I'll cut it up, then I'll reassemble it. And that's very similar to the way these wooden pieces are made. So these wooden pieces came out of the last work. They were kind of the idea that was still left on the table. So in my last big show, I had these like large plaster pieces, and that generated, the making of those pieces generated lots of wood and scrap essentially. And I started kind of making things out of those scrap pieces of wood, out of the leftover bits, kind of like the pieces of paper, saving every little bit, you know, kind of squirreling it out. As we both know, we both kind of generate work and then have a lot of mess, and then kind of live with that mess. So these pieces were kind of the wooden pieces were the kind of the ideas left on the table. They were like little tangential projects. And what made sense, I've made the work that's in the show over the last about roughly a year. The oldest piece in here is about since last November, so pretty much exactly a year. And it felt very natural if I look back on it. During the process, it felt very scattered and disorganized. But when I kind of look back on this body of work, there's the blocks of wood, which were kind of scraps glued together into kind of blocks, just like the paper were these scraps of blocks of marks. And the wood pieces themselves are marks, scraps of marks. And I worked with staples because I've been working with staples for years within my work, making whole drawings out of staples. But essentially, it was also just a tool in my studio. And it allowed me to assemble these, disassemble them, assemble them, disassemble them. So the wood pieces were made the same way the collage pieces were. Cut up, reassembled, thinking with my hands. And so part of, getting back to your question, like what is the through line with these processes, is coming up with a way of working allows me to get to a place where I can think with my hands. And I'm experimenting with ways of working that I both have control, I can work forward and backwards, but also a lack of control where I can discover, where I can just put two things together and go, oh, that is something new. It's more than the sum of its parts. And this, to me, this show really screams that. It's more than the sum of these small parts together. And so I think the thinking with the hands is what I'm kind of always trying to find a way to get to.
So thinking about that, thinking with your hands, that brings to mind something that I've noticed in your work. You've always had, I would say, and I'm sorry if I keep referencing back, but I've known your work for so long, and I've seen it develop and shift, and yet always stay true to itself. Always be like, I can always know that's Emily's work. You know, you're not. It's always a natural progression. But one of the things that has been a through line is an economy of language, and that you generally use a fairly limited vocabulary in your work in regards to what elements you're bringing into an image or an object. And that's never really been more the case than it is with this show.
Yeah, totally.
And I would say that the show that you had at Oxbow and just probably the last 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm. It's gotten more and more limited.
It's gotten more and more limited. And so the idea is when you talk about thinking with your hands, is the fact that you are using rather regimented marks. There's a lot of repetition. There's variation within that. But you seem to be, you're almost in an odd way working in a way that takes the hand out of it, or what one likes,
like the gestural hand. Yeah, the gestural hand.
Hand that does this, and I don't know what this hand is doing.
Yeah.
So, and there's something about that's, as I said, that it seems very honest and direct, and it sublimates the ego a bit.
Yeah, they don't feel like gestural self-portraits, right? But they are in a way because they are an accumulation of decisions that I make.
Yes.
I will say that the work does start out a little fuller. Not every piece, some of the drawings are, made with just a couple materials. But, I'm looking at a piece over here that, started off bright red, and, started off red and had lots of different kind of colors in it. And it wasn't that like I started those out kind of unhonestly. Like I didn't start out thinking to myself, I'm going to cover this up. This is all going away anyway. Yeah. It was really kind of like the decision in the moment. And as I kind of live with the piece, work with the piece, they do become more distilled. And I think that it has to do with my interest in kind of controlling or understanding, I think is a better word than controlling, every single variable. So, the drawing that I'm looking at right here, it has lots of different types of Okawara papers. So, there's one that's older and pink, and there's one that's like a newer one that's kind of more the yellow that we're both very familiar with this paper.
And in the variations.
And the variations over the last maybe 15 years of the mill kind of slowly changing or being bought up and all these kind of technical things that happen with this one particular paper. And so that it kind of varies from pinks to whites to creams. So to me, there's massive variation. And when I look at the marks which I make with a ruler and the side of a charcoal, I see the difference between like a mark that's made with the tip and a mark that's made with the side, and the mark that's made with a slightly dull pencil or something that's made with the 2B versus the 4B. And as I'm grabbing, I'm deliberately saying, okay, I'm grabbing this tool and this tool and this tool, and we'll make a mark and be like, I need to adjust that. I need to adjust that. That line is too bold. And so to me, maybe it's just I'm over.
Getting that out loud. I really don't want that to be an interior monologue. I want.
You're me shouting,
if someone actually had a camera in there.
Oh, totally. I mean, I definitely mumble and talk to myself constantly. And so I think that I've always kind of compared my interest in this question, like how distilled the work is, to the same conversation when I was painting with oil paint and using color, like colors that the loud thing that's missing from all this. And I was kind of described it as being like when you walk into a room, there's a couple different types of people. One person walks into a room and says hello to every single person. And one person walks into the room, finds that one person and talks to them for 40 minutes really intensely. I am that.
Which one
Yes, I am that latter person who walks into a room and I'm only looking to talk to one person, okay, in that room, and that would be enough for me. And so Yeah, that is what I'm looking for, the subtle variation. And by distilling and taking out the bright red that was in this piece over here, I was able to kind of get down to just looking at the difference between flash black and oil paint black, and something that I had steel wooled, and something that I had sanded, something that the back was actually burned. And those subtle differences, that kind of conversations, the one that the work is trying to build towards. I keep looking at some of these other pieces, and I'm just like, people will describe them as like, the different shades of black, and I'm like, you mean the blue? The bright blue? that is? Like, that's black, that's bright blue. To me, it's like so obviously this bright blue.
It's burned into your memory.
Yeah, and as that difference, because that difference is so palpable and physical in the work to me. So I don't know that I'm like narrowing it down, or reducing the work, but just like looking at smaller differences.
Yeah, in that regard, and how when you talk about the way that the graphite or the paint or what have you is reacting upon the surface and the variations in the surface, and it brings to point another thing that I've been thinking about. This is something that, once again, reaches back through your earlier bodies of work, but once again, it seems more and more present in that this dichotomy between image and object.
Yeah,
that
totally.
Many of these, the drawings as well, obviously the sculptures, but the drawings as well, really have a sense of object before image.
Yeah.
And that there's a palpable physicality to them, that the way that they're presented, almost, and it's reinforced by the way that they're constructed, but they seem like they are something, and they're not depicted something. To me, it's like that is in and of itself. But I also know that many of these are actually drawn from something, depicting something, or at least that's where the germ of the idea comes from. So I'm interested how that balances out, because you're drawing, you're making, you're doing, but at the end it becomes this thing that transcends the idea of mark making. It becomes something in and of itself. It's indelibly in the work.
Yeah, I think that has been like an underlying question in my work, and it's always been this dichotomy. And I have come to, whether these are objects, whether they're sculptures, whether I am making an image of something or I'm making the thing itself. I mean, that was in the earliest work when I was, I did a series in my early 20s of printmaking of prints that were very they really kind of solidified some of the same things that I'm exploring this day, where the way it was made was directly tied to the image. This kind of circles back to process and image. So I had a plate. It was a physical, copper plate that was totally covered with an aquatint, so totally covered with tone, with value, made by pits, right? And the image was a wall deteriorating. The plate was just a solid black wall that I then scraped and buffed and kind of essentially carved out the form. So there was a direct connection between the image and how it was made. And that's echoed through so many of my works. I had a large painting that had this staccato repetition mark that actually kind of probably where all these staccato marks came from, are these small marks, where I was taking an eyedropper and dropping solvent and cutting through layers of paint, catching that drip, so that the whole form was made by it being kind of dripping, eaten away, which had to do with, scored. And so there was a direct, and that process was only created for that one painting. So
But
throughout,
it led to this.
it maybe led to these marks, and these marks then, so there has always been this connection going back to process between the image and how it was made. I do think that these also become objects as they become three-dimensional forms. This one's not even on a wall anymore, crazy. But I think over the years I've kind of realized that like that dichotomy is within painting. I am still a painter, as I said at the beginning. I am not a sculptor. I am obsessed with two-dimensional language and the tension within two-dimensional language. The idea that something can be a physical object and an image of a painting. It is both a physical, it can depict a physical space that you imagine your body moving around, but that physical movement within your body happens within your head. So it is a physical response to a painting. Sometimes I'll create paintings that are top heavy, or these are shaped so that they feel unbalanced. That one kind of leans in. So they do kind of feel like that you respond with your body. But it's a two-dimensional image, so you're really making that journey in a lot of cases with your mind. So there's that tension that happens in the two-dimensional space. That means that that is still very important to me. So while they become, like they're made like objects and the making of them is important, to me they're still tied to that flat space. They still kind of retreat back to the wall so that they can retreat to that two-dimensional space, that language that I actually understand and know. Not the verbal language, but this like two-dimensional language that I really feel and keeps me making work. Yeah.
So the sculpture, were the three-dimensional paintings? So are you seeing these blocks that are, the detritus from previous work, and you're assembling them together? Are you seeing these, like, those are like, it's obvious you can tie those to the strokes of the thing, but when you are assembling them, do you think about that in that same way?
Yeah, to me they're lines. They're blocks of mark.
So my assumption, and I could be wrong, like so many of my assumptions, was that the staples were merely ornamental, but are they actually the only thing holding this stuff together?
So it's a combination. They're both glue and staples.
Okay.
So they're blocks that are glued. But the staples are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, and that's important to me because just like the paper can be just kind of cut, when I started this body of work, I was looking for that way to think with my hands, to work in a non-linear way. The previous show that I had to this was made with these large plaster blocks. And that work was very much designed ahead of time and then executed. So in other words, like it
wasn't intuitive, it was planned and constructed.
It was planned and constructed. I had, a digital file with like how the image was going to be broken down with a 3D model of the piece that so that I could really plan it and work it and execute it. And it wasn't made in a linear fashion. Like I made it in a logical way, like this plate to this plate to this plate to this plate. So it wasn't like built. These are kind of returning to being able to work just with, here's a block, I staple it together, it doesn't work, I pull it apart.
They kind of intuitively just kind of grow into these
pieces,
okay.
So I can, I'll have a plan for a little bit, it won't work, I'll sit there with my pliers, pull the whole thing apart, I'll cut something, and by making a cut with my miter saw, it'll kind of send the form off in this direction, then I'll have to like bring it back to this one, so I can really like the paper. Just cut and rearrange, look at it, cut and rearrange. And these things, this piece was pulled apart many, many times and has like little remnants of, completely different pieces. Wood is expensive, which I kind of love. Paper is expensive. So I love using that to make the materials precious and to reuse them over and over and over again.
And to build up that history. Do you find that working with the wood, does it give you more freedom?
I don't know.
I mean, the way that you're working with it?
I think the way I'm working with it now is
It seems a lot more intuitive and what's
it's
the word I'm
sturdy.
looking for?
You can beat it up. You can
Yeah.
reuse it. You can glue it back together. You can staple it together. Yeah, I think that I think I've been, with this show and with this body of work that's in this show, to me, the way I was able to work kind of ties all this work together. The way I was able to just develop these pieces as I made them is what kind of links these two, both the drawings and the wood share that. And I was looking for a way to make those two things happen. And so the drawings and the wood pieces happened kind of simultaneously. I was able to like spend some time drawing. It would give me some ideas. Then I'd come back to the work, to the wood pieces. I'd be able to like not make copies, but kind of still think that way, solidify
Take that
things
idea into here.
in its own way, make some modifications, and then return back. So they both kind of develop simultaneously.
Is gravity and that kind of tension part of that conversation where that I noticed, I can't remember which one of these, maybe it's around the other side, and where there's a gap in the wood and it pulls itself back together. And it feels like, okay, well that's gravity saying, hey, don't forget about me a little bit, and re-interjecting itself into it, which just doubles down on the materiality and the dependency upon medium for its identity. Is that part of that?
Well, gravity has always existed in my work. Yes, I'm an abstract.
Away from it.
Yeah, but I think that artists do. I mean, like the work is abstract, but it follows certain rules, and the rule gravity.
You're like top heavy. You're like, so people
Everything-
are having
Yeah.
physical, and that goes
back to the fact
object thing.
That goes back to the object thing, but it also goes back to this idea that this work is not landscape, it's not building, but is figurative. It is figurative in nature, which ties back to, you reference the source material for a lot of my work. For the last 20 years, a lot of my work has been pulled from historical figurative painting.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, that is the root of a lot of this imagery, or even just way of thinking.
Is that a way? Is that simply a jumping off point? Is there a art historical reverence that's being at play? Is it just a natural way for you to find an inroad?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the reverence is definitely a part of it. It's more than so to be clear, a lot of this work pulls the gestures and the poses from figurative work. In this show, Kathy Kollwitz, a lot of this work is pulling forms and shapes and gestures out of a drawing by the artist Kathy Kollwitz called Mothers from like 1918. She did a series of drawings, but the one I kind of look at for this. And so they're not just figures in the sense that they respond like figures or I'm thinking of figures. They're like directly looking at a visual figure and pulling from that. So it's very direct. And to me, it's more than a jumping off point. The piece itself, I have used lots of different historical images over the years, and what those pieces have in common is the figures, they're always in kind of like the liminal moment where they're transitioning from one to the next. So there is it is a two-dimensional image, but it captures this transition time period. They do tend to be very heavy in content, and the way they're made is how you feel that emotion. And so I've always been interested in that idea that the work is more than the sum of its parts. It's more than just the fact that this is a picture of a grieving mother. It's something in the DNA, the composition of that piece, the way the marks were put on the page, the way they were composed, the shape of the form.
The different approaches within that.
And the different approaches within this specific image that this work is based off of. In that drawing, Kathy Kollwitz, it's a drawing, but she does different drawing styles. Some are very delicate, some are very bold. Each of the mothers is almost drawn in a different style,
yes.
which is very unusual for that time period, and very even unusual for her. Though I've always thought the way she...
It seems something odd that at that time period that it would have got out of the studio.
Yeah, well, she's famous.
Nobody's going to understand. So put this back in the file cabinet for a while.
Yeah, there's always those great moments where the artist is like established and famous enough that like these things get saved. So I think that there's something in the, like, to come back to it, there's something in the DNA of the piece that's more than just the fact that you're reading it was a human, okay? And so it's that, like, can art have this power? Can it be, poetry versus prose? Can you get a sense of what this piece is about without any, like, visual references?
So that brings to mind, when you're talking about that particularly Kollwitz drawing of the mothers has some real emotional heft to it. And there's a thematic, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not an undercurrent, it's an overcurrent, it's all over the damn thing.
Yeah,
and I'm wondering, as you translate that, so, when and everybody, there's all different ways that we are inspired and use other people's work to drive our work forward. Every artist does it to varying degrees. But you seem to do it in a specific manner, and it makes me wonder, like, do the thematic threads of the piece travel through your translation of it, not just compositionally, but the actual thematic content of the work? And do you see that there? And you mentioned earlier that, like, there's X amount that you have control of in the studio. I can this thing and do this thing hanging on the wall, and then it's up to you. But for you, when you're seeing that, do you see, okay, this is really capturing the somberness or the anger or the fear or the frustration? Because there's a lot of different faces, and I mean literally in the piece, but there's also faces as far as the way the face that we present to the world. So there's a lot of different, emotion that comes out of that single piece. And so I'm wondering how that gets translated.
Yeah, I think that for me, the content is key, right? The thematical, it's an image.
It's not just a composition.
It's not just a composition. It is a selection of that specific piece. And I think, as you look at this piece, it's a crowd of mothers. Each of them are kind of dealing with kind of just exhaustion and grief and the ravages, in this case, of war, in a very different way. And as I kind of work from this piece over and over again, the content is so important that it's interesting. Like, my plan was to make, with this work, and I'm still developing, work that responds to each of those mothers, each of those kind of characters. But as I work with the work, as I really am honest and try to understand the piece and the mark making of the piece, the central figure is really important to me. I understand her emotion. So she is like...
That kind of dominated
because, and I think it's because of that direct connection. She's a mother, she is sitting there, she is desperately holding her children. Her children are these beautiful glowing forms that are delicately drawn. And she has this intensity where every single mark kind of presses in on them. So she's both kind of becomes this form that almost looks like she's protecting them. I am a mother, and so I understand that emotion of kind of protecting, but she also is, they also feel like they're supporting her, like they're this solid form. So she's both protecting them, but they're defining, yeah, they're defining her. She's defined by her relationship with them, which, you know, I feel very intensely as a mother. You know, I am both very protective and supportive, but I also, you know, acknowledge how much my life is dominated by this one human, you know, and that is actually.
Oh, she knows it too.
Oh, she definitely does too, right? You know, that intensity, I like look at the image of that mother just like intensely both supporting, holding, but also being defined by them. And I understand that.
Somebody who has a couple of pugs, so I
yeah, totally. You got it.
I know exactly what you mean. When they sit there and you scratch their belly.
Yeah, totally, right? Yeah. So I recognize that intensity within that image, and I can feel that intensity. And I think that I have, as I have revisited work over and over again, the themes and the content of the piece has always been crucial. You know, I did a whole series of work based on Bruegel's The Blind Leading the Blind. And it was not subtle to me how you had, you know, figures tripping and pulling each other down as a parallel for political discourse. You know, so there was nothing subtle about the fact that it was not just the image, but the content. You know, sometimes I choose the work for more kind of personal reasons, and I kind of return to Kollwitz again and again for kind of more personal reasons. I look to other artists and pull from their historical artists and pull from their work for more kind of social commentary. And so both of those things can kind of exist in the studio. And I also, you know, I work, the themes in the work are really important to me. I work on these pieces kind of stumbling in the dark for weeks and months and continually returning to the source material and to the content and the narrative and the ideas that are in that source material keep me focused. Because, you know, when you're working with materials, you can get distracted. You can fall down the path of like, oh, these marks are so beautiful. I love them.
It's really easy to fetishize.
It's easy to fetishize.
Oh, that beautiful patina on that thing. And I can't cover that up. You get attached to things.
Exactly. But I come back to the source material, and it keeps me, you know, for lack of better, it keeps me focused. It keeps me back to saying, okay,
this is what I need to say.
This is what I need to say.
Primal.
Yeah.
In primacy, as opposed to, you know, the other things that are easy and seductive.
Yeah, materials are seductive. I love materials. I love surface. You've heard me talk about how, like, I obviously fetishize the materials, but that's not the point of the work. And so,
and it's obvious because there's a glut of people whose work is almost just the fetishization of the material.
And the love of process, and I get it.
I get it too.
Yeah, totally.
Then it becomes that. Then it never gets past that facade or that golly gee whiz, look what I did, and or look what this thing can do. And I think that, you know, what you've done, you know, consistently is transcend that, and it's about the respect for that, but also the respect for, you know, that singular vision that is the driving force behind each piece, each body of work. Speaking of that theme, and that from the Kollwitz drawing and moving through the work, you mentioned that was something that was, and the way that's what's the word, how that gets balanced is something that led to the title of the show. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, so the title of the show is Not a Billboard, and I think that title, it's not a direct reference to a quote or anything. To me, it's kind of like a mantra of, kind of my own personal mantra of the fact that the work is abstract, that it does have clear thematic ideas, but that it's poetry, not prose, that it is not a billboard. It's not just declaring this is what it is.
It's of something, not about something.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of saying it. I think I think that there's so much of the work it's kind of felt, and so there isn't always a logic. Yes, I'm pulling from a Kathy Kollwitz. Yes, I tie the way materials are, how I use materials to the content of something. There's all these like very straightforward linear things, but within that, the real pleasure of doing this is that you really don't know. It is more than the sum of its parts. You take this leap into the work, and it takes you on these different journeys. It's not as direct as, like this is the subject, this is the materials. And I think that that's very true in this show. I felt with my last show that I had, which we've referenced a couple times, which makes sense. I spent 2 years working on that show. It was a very physical experience for me. The content in that work was really clear. The work was made in this very linear way. I described it as being kind of developed up front and then executed. This work was made with hands, and therefore every single moment that I made a small decision, listening to that kind of quieter voice as opposed to that loud, here's my content, influenced the work. And so that not a billboard is kind of an acknowledgement that this work, that in the talking about the work meaning A, B, and C, is that acknowledgement that like, does it really mean that?
Well, so what?
Or is that all it is? Right?
No, it seems like, the thing is, this work could sit side by side with that work from the Oxbow show. It's definitely, there's points of departure, but and it makes me wonder, is that because you did, if that show was more front-loaded, that work was more conceived and then executed, which, I can understand, like, I've almost everything I do now is 90% conceived and then executed.
Yeah.
I get to have fun at the end.
Totally.
But you kind of, with that body of work, you worked in that way, and I wonder if that set you up to be able to now just work with your hands, because you kind of did this work front loading.
I also
over the
think
years,
there's
building that a certain vocabulary and approach and understanding.
Yeah, there's a simpler elephant in the room. We just went through a global pandemic in which I'm a mother and a teacher and lost all my childcare. I have to work, go to my studio and make things still, right?
Yeah.
But I can't. And paradoxically, you would think planning and executing would be easier to work, but in truth, I've spent so much time in kind of a quiet, domestic, isolated setting. Communicating through my teachers through the computer. Spending hours and hours with my family and my child, and so the kind of small, like, make this, shift it, cut this up, shift it. That is the scale to which my brain is. Yeah. And so this work is very much like trying to reconnect with just like almost making a survival, like, as opposed to this big grand, like, make something and present it to the world. This is like making in a domestic space for survival.
Yeah. Were you kind of piecing together time in the studio, little scraps of time that you could get in between?
Yeah, I think every parent does that. Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that, there's that, almost everything I'm surrounded by is an amalgam of fragments. And I'm wondering if that directly reflects your studio experience, that you could steal away an hour here. Ooh, I got 5 hours today.
Yeah, totally.
But you kind of, and then going back in for the, oh man, I got 20 minutes here. And if that kind of more intuitive approach came out of that, but also that studio experience expressed itself in the nature of the work.
I think there's both that, and it goes a little deeper. Like, I want to be making the work, and I want, when you're in this time period that we've been through, like, I want to be in a room making marks and making a drawing and cutting it up. That is like what I want. I want to be thinking. I don't want to be planning. I'm not thinking big, grand like statements. I'm thinking like I am a human in a space using this moment. Mm-hmm. And I think this work really speaks to that.
Yeah. No, I there's something, and it goes back to there's something direct and honest, and it's unfussy, and it's true to that. It feels like it is the product of just attention and time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, thank you for spending the time with me and the good people out there, and sharing your work with us and your thoughts about making it. And I've known you for quite some time. We've talked about work for some time, and I'm always learning something new and about you and your work and what I need to do better.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. I think that, when work's in their studio very quietly and never knows how these things come across. And so to be able to awkwardly say the things, right, it is very powerful. It's very powerful for an artist to like declaratively say something out loud, to name their ideas. So I appreciate you taking the time to help me do that.
Fully my pleasure. Well, thank you for taking time with us today to discuss Emily's work down here at the J. Rinehart Gallery. I highly recommend you find a way down here to see this work in person, because that is how it should be seen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to David and to Emily for that amazing conversation. There are so many layers to your work, both literally and figuratively, and I just love that you took us on a journey through the process and your intention behind the work. A link to the Kathy Cowitz drawing is in the description below if you'd like to get a better sense of that. The exhibition, Not a Billboard, is on view in the gallery and online at jrinehartgallery.com through November 24th, 2021. You can follow us on Instagram at jrinehartgallery and click to subscribe below to get notifications for new episodes. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the gallery.